I'm Howard Blumenthal, and we are somewhere in the low 20s in terms of the number of episodes that we've now done on Reinventing School. So thank you again for joining us. This week, an unusual situation because we only have one guest for the hour. We haven't done that before. So it's kind of fun to introduce Dr. Laurie Santos, who I know from a little bit of adventure beforehand through my interest in positive education and positive psychology. Laurie, you may be aware of because you may have read about her, but that'll come out in the story. So welcome, Laurie. And the object of this is to try to help people understand what positive education is and how it fits into the larger scheme of how we learn and who we become. So we have a lot to talk about.
Thanks
so
so much.
Tell us a bit about what you're like, where you are and what you do, day by day and all that. And then maybe we'll scoot into early days a little bit and get a sense of how you got there.
Yeah. So I'm Laurie Santos. I'm a professor of psychology at Yale University. But in addition to being a professor of psychology, I'm also a head of college on campus. And so Yale's kind of one of these weird schools like Hogwarts, like in Harry Potter, where there's like colleges within a college, So I'm head of Silliman College, no relation at all to Slytherin, even though it kind of sounds similar. But in this role, I kind of have a slightly different role. Now, I'm not just like teaching students at the front of the classroom. I'm kind of thinking about how to create a community for them and really hanging out with students in the trenches. So I eat with them in the dining hall, I hang out with them at the coffee shop. And, I've been doing this role now for just over 4 years. And when I first started, I was really shocked at what I was seeing on college campuses. I was seeing this so-called mental health crisis up close and personal with, students I talked to who were just like shockingly more depressed, shockingly more anxious, shockingly more stressed than I remember being when I was in college. And it wasn't the kind of thing I even saw, at the front of the classroom. And so, just all these cases of students who were just kind of fast forwarding their time in college, like, how's it going? Like, I'm just trying to get to the weekend, or I'm just trying to get to midterm. I'm just, trying to get, to the end of the semester. So much stress about things in the future, like internships and those sorts of things. And like really acute mental health dysfunction, like acute suicidality, acute panic attacks. Like it wasn't the kind of happy college time I remembered. And so this was kind of shocking to me because it made me realize, if we're not really addressing student mental health issues, then we're not really succeeding in our job to like educate college students, right? And I think this is true in colleges, but it's also true in high schools. Go ahead.
So is this different from the way it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago? Or are we just measuring it more now and more aware of it now? Or has something actually changed?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, in some ways, that's sort of the million-dollar question. It's hard to get at, right? Because we know mental health stuff is definitely less stigmatized than it was 20 years ago. We also know that students talk differently about what's going on. They use a lot of clinical terms. It's just kind of in the ether. It's, before, when I was scared before presentation in class, I might have butterflies in my stomach. Now I'm like anxious, right? So students are using different terms. But, when you control for all that stuff, it really does seem like on standard measures, rates of things like depression and anxiety have gotten much worse. And they've gotten much worse in like really small time scales. So the rates of students who self-report being very depressed have doubled in just the last 8 to 9 years, right? And I don't think, the stigma has gone down that much since like 2012, for example, right? But we're seeing like twice the rates of things like depression. And it's not just depression and anxiety, things like loneliness are going up. Suicidality is going up. Actually, at the national level, this isn't just in the Ivy League or just at Yale. Nationally right now, over 12% of college students report seriously considering suicide in the last year. So more than 1 in 10. So, it's a real crisis, and it's kind of a new crisis as far as we can tell, or at least a crisis that's getting worse over time, not better.
Now, there's a survey that I spent a lot of time with, but I don't remember the name of it, that looks at 25,000 college students every year. Can you talk about that? Because that to me is a source that people can actually go to and read and be as astonished as I was.
Yeah, there's a couple really big surveys. So one is through the National Health Organization, the National Health College Council, and they're the ones that the statistics I was talking about are coming from. But I think the survey you mean is a thing that's called the Freshman Survey, which is a survey that's actually been running for decades now. It started, I think, in the 1960s. And so it's kind of a snapshot of college life throughout that. And they ask these incoming freshmen all these questions about like, what do you want out of life? Like what would it be to be successful in these things? And that survey has also been seeing these like really incredible changes. So one of my favorite ones about it is looking at what students want out of life. So how important is it for you, for example, to be financially successful? What you see is rates of students saying that that's very important in life have doubled like since the 1960s, which maybe that makes sense. But a similar question has gone down by the same rate, which is the question of how important is it to develop a meaningful philosophy on life? Like back in the 60s, people thought that was really important, but now students are like, meaningful philosophy, like throw that out. As long as I'm financially stable, I'm going to go for it. And so even these kind of really large scale surveys that are really trying to get, a really broad demographic survey of what's going on in college life, again, not just like at Yale or in the Ivy League, but community colleges, state colleges, and so on, we're seeing these really robust changes, not just in students' mental health, but also in what they think is important for living a life of meaning and purpose. And all those things are pretty disturbing.
So the $2 million question then is why?
Yeah, I think we don't have a good
any idea.
Yeah, if I did, I would be, like solving it, right? Yeah, I think honestly, we don't know. I think there's probably a ton of different factors, right? One of the factors really is, I think, that students are prioritizing the wrong stuff. As a professor of psychology, I know the kinds of things that are really important for improving well-being. There are things like taking time for social connection, being present, making sure you have time for healthy habits like sleep and exercise and these things. Doing nice things for others, being other-oriented, not being selfish. And it almost feels like if you look at parenting and education guides from 2020, it's like students are called upon to prioritize exactly the opposite, right? Like grades, 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 and your accolades and your next steps and your financial success at all costs, like at the cost of sleep, at the cost of friendship, at the cost of any time to do this other stuff. Selfishness, almost like as a general rule, like pull yourself up as much as possible, not as much worry about other folks or what can you do to be of service and so on. And so I think that our culture about what education is about and what you should be doing has changed a lot, just at a basic level. I also think there's just lots of changes in terms of how students spend their time. And those changes have a lot to do with the kinds of, devices that students have access to that are really different. A lot has been made of like, is social media, causing depression and anxiety. I actually worry less specifically about social media than I do just about technology in general. The mere presence of your phone means that you're kind of obsessed with looking at your phone in a way that in theory is supposed to socially connect you. But in practice, I watch students in my dining hall with these big headphones on staring at their phone and not connecting with other people. And then we get students reporting at rates of around 65% that they say they're very lonely most of the time, right? Those are the devices that are pinging me, not just about my social media alerts, but, what's happening in the news, which, at the time we're talking about this is the kind of thing that can shoot up our stress hormones and make us kind of, have our cortisol increase and things like that. The deadlines that are coming up, that next meeting that's coming up. And there's just a ton of distracting stuff on there that makes it really hard to not multitask, but single task, which is the thing that kind of promotes well-being. So being present, having flow in a particular activity, those things are just much harder from technology. And so it's hard to, correlation does not equal causation, but if you look at when the rates of this stuff started to really exponentially spike up, it's around the time that the iPhone came out. So it's around 2007. And so how correlated these things are, we don't know, but my guess would be that there's something going on with our use of technology that's really negatively affecting our well-being in ways we don't really understand. So
before we couldn't travel, the last trip I took for this Kids on Earth project that most of the people who watch know about now was to India. And I was really excited about going to India because I felt that there would be a higher level of integration between inner life and external life. And sure enough, I interviewed 40 or 50 students, each one for about a half hour, and every one of them gave me what I was hoping I would see. And all of them were about 12 years old, 11 years old, maybe 13. And then I did a lecture for the older kids because they were involved with tests or something. And all of them were much more like the kids you're talking about. So in 5 years, in 4 years, I don't want to say they lost childhood innocence. They sort of detached themselves from the things they knew worked really well for them. So I wondered whether, and I asked both the younger groups and the older, do you think that you're a different generation who learned differently over these 5 years? Or do you think somehow the combination of school and this is an upscale school, so they're very career oriented. Do you think that as you drew closer to, I have to choose my life, that you ignored all the things that were special to you before? What happened to you? And they were all like, okay, this is terrifying. We think about this a little bit, but we don't like to think about it. I'm like, wow, you see a truth in this. So, and it was just so interesting because it was so consistent across so many different people in two schools, not in every school in India. But it struck me, and I thought of you actually there thinking, well, you're going to end up with a basket of these kids who you're going to have to help unlearn because of what you're doing at Yale. So you've told the story about 1,000,000 times, I'm sure, but can you give us a brief version, because this will help people connect to you and understand that, oh yeah, that's that person.
Yeah. No, so there I was as head of college, just being bombarded with just honestly the misery of my students, or even the ones who weren't miserable were just like not flourishing, not living college in the way I'd hoped they were living college. And so it wasn't clear what I could do to help, but I'm a professor of psychology. I teach, lectures to undergraduates. I teach classes. And so I said, let me develop a class on this stuff. We actually know a lot about evidence-based strategies you can use to feel better. The stuff that does work to feel happy and the stuff that doesn't work. I'll just develop a class on this. I'll tell students, these are the things that don't work. These are the things that work. And can I give them like homework assignments that allowed them to build this stuff up so that they could put the good strategies into practice? And so I developed.
Let me stop you for a second. So when you explain that to friends, to people who are not in this, who don't think this way every day, are they thinking, so you're going to be like the happy fairy? Like, what are you talking about? Is this something that actually can be done? So what was the pushback like before you started actually doing this?
Yeah, well, what's surprising is that when I first started, the pushback at Yale was like incredibly little, quite the opposite. When I first submitted the class, there's like a power that be that review classes at Yale, their reaction was like, no changes. We hope a lot of students take this. This is really needed on campus. And I think that reflects the fact that, so many administrators are seeing what I see, which is like, this is not what college is supposed to be like, right? And like these students are so ill in some ways, honestly, and they really need strategies to help them. So like on campus, I think the reaction was like, phew, at least somebody's going to try to take care of this and give them some strategies. I think beyond, I sometimes got a different reaction, which is like, really, we need to teach happiness to college students now, right? Like, these poor snowflake kids, like, can't even figure out how to be happy. We're going to teach them happiness 101. And I get it, but, my reaction was, our job as college educators is to make sure students are learning, right? So that we're able to educate them so that they can go off and be in finance or in teaching or in whatever they're going to do after this. And if you look at the rates of mental health dysfunction we were seeing, where over 12% of students are acutely suicidal at some point during an academic year, or where 40% of them say they're too depressed to function, or around 70% are saying they're overwhelmingly anxious, like they're not learning stuff. They're not like retaining Chaucer and computer science in the way we think. Like, think of a time that if you've ever experienced an acute mental health event when you're like really stressed or really depressed, like, you're not picking up all the stuff that we're hoping that they're paying money for us to teach them. We just can't teach them if they're in this state. And so even folks who kind of reacted like, really, you want to teach these snowflakes, blah, blah, blah. When you really look at the level of dysfunction you're dealing with, these aren't a couple stressed students, who are upset about getting a B+. Like, this is a real generational crisis that we're dealing with. And so, yeah, so I really took it on as my job, not just to teach them this stuff, but like, we're failing in our mission as educators if we're not addressing this level of a mental health crisis in this generation. And so not too much pushback on campus, some pushback off, but, when I really push the issue of like, we're not meeting our mission, right? This has to be part of it, given the generation of students we have walking through our doors. And so put this whole class together. Wasn't sure what was going to happen. As a new psychology class at Yale, I thought, 30 or so students would take it. Was shocked when the class started breaking, every metric we had to track student interest. At the time, we had this little ticker. It was like a sort of a student interest thing of how many students were registering for the course. And I knew something was weird with this course because usually the scale on that little metric went from 0 to 100 students, because that's, kind of a big class at Yale. But when I logged on, my scale was going from 0 to 1,000. And I was like, that's weird that I'm an order of magnitude off in how many students are looking at this. But in the end, we had around 1,200 students who took the class. It was just under 1 out of every 4 students, around 1 out of every 4 students, 1 out of every 5 students took the class. which was shocking and posed a ton of logistical challenges. Like, where do you put that many students other than like the football stadium? And we couldn't use the football stadium. But it also showed me that students are voting with their feet. Like, they, just kind of exactly what you were saying about the kids in India. Like, they get it. They don't like to think about it, but they know that this is the culture of stress, and that they're not as mentally healthy as they could be, and that their friends aren't as mentally healthy as they could be. And they want to do something about it. They don't like this, and they're looking for a solution.
So I'm 30 years old. Do I have the same issues? I'm 40 years old. You said it's a generational thing. Does that mean that this generation is especially sharply, acutely affected by this, or are they the first ones who are speaking up? A little similar to what we were talking about before.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the extent to which the rates are changing so fast suggests to me that this isn't just a stigma issue. Of course, there is a stigma, right? It was harder for generations before this generation to admit this stuff, but it shouldn't be spiking in just the last 5 years, and that's the kind of thing we're seeing. If you look at rates, on campus, we get these rates of students who are using mental health services on campus, and it's just exponential. My colleague who runs the mental health services here, Paul Hoffman, is fond of saying, that slope is gonna level off, but that's because we're gonna have 100% of students in services all the time. Like, that's when the slope's gonna level off, right? And that feels different than what I'm in my mid 40s now. That feels different than when I was in college, right? And I think that feels different. I mean, the data suggests it feels different than it did just 10 years ago. We didn't see rates like this in 2010. And we're seeing, in some cases, double the rates that we were experiencing now. And that's, when you say double, that's incredible. Like, that means we need double the services. That means we need double the extensions from students who are just too depressed to get papers in. That means we're entering the workforce is double the number of people who have serious enough mental health dysfunction, that they need some help, right? And so I think we really just do need to address this.
But it's more than double, because you want people preventing. Double only gets you to dealing with the existing condition, not with how do you prevent the. So take me back to you in college.
Me in college.
Yeah. What did you see? I mean, what was life like? And clearly it was different, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'll be honest that one of the reasons I decided to teach the class was that I saw a lot of the seeds of myself in these students, right? I'm a busy academic, and, I'm trying to get tenure at an Ivy League institution, and got tenure at Ivy League institution, and I'm piling more on my plate, and, searching for the next accolade, and doing that at the expense of, like time with my friends and time with my family, and often sleep and these things. And so I could see the seeds of like my bad tendencies in them. But it seemed like the kind of thing that I experienced in college was like so much worse in this generation, right? Like I went to Ivy League school. I went to that other Ivy League school that we don't like to talk about, the dark crimson side, right?
Got it.
But things were stressful. It was stressful, during midterms and finals, but not at the expense of my social relationships, right? Like I wasn't so frantically worried about the next step of the future that I was like putting off stuff. There were people who had mental health issues and substance use issues when I was there, but it wasn't, like 3/4 of the people I knew who were actively dealing with an acute mental health situation. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing on college campuses right now. And so, that stuff was there, and the motivations were there, and the insecurities were there, and the imposter syndrome was there, but not at the acute levels we're seeing right now.
Okay. So take me to the state school in upstate New York that isn't an Ivy League school. It's a good school, but it's kind of in the middle. Yeah. And let's roll it back 20 years before that. A lot of beer, a lot of, whoa, you're really stoned. That's really cool. Yeah. And a fair amount of irresponsibility, just having fun.
Yeah, and I think
how different is that from your experience, and how different is that from 20 years hence? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know where we're going to be 20 years from now. I mean, one of the things is that, honestly, on the ground, it feels like students seem to have trouble having fun. One of the things that people in student services often talk about is that, binge drinking still happens on campus. There's still a lot of drinking, but the form of it is very different. And I'll give you a sense of the form of it that I see in our students, and why. And in some ways, the form of it is like worse now, which is that students are incredibly busy. They're like working on stuff for extracurriculars till some point at which they're like, I got to party, but they're like, I have to catch up. I have to like go big or go home, like FOMO. And so they do a bunch of shots to like catch up. So it's not like binge drinking in the way, you know, I don't know, I wasn't a big binge drinker in college, my friends were, but like the binge drinking in the way it was portrayed back then, where it's like, you know, all day parties and we're out playing flip cup and, you know, just having beers all day. It's, I gotta work really efficiently. I gotta party really efficiently. Let me take like 4 shots right now to kind of catch up and pregame and this stuff, right? And so it feels like even fun is regimented and it's scheduled. And that's the generation that these students are coming from, right? You know, like I think, you know, when they were kids, this is the generation that first started scheduling like, you know, soccer dates and play dates, and then you go to do your homework and these kinds of things, not in the way I remember growing up. If you want to go really back, where it's like, I would just go play in the yard. I didn't have to get scheduled with my friend to go play in the yard. We just like played in the yard, right? Whereas I think these kids, you know, from their early life, it's kind of like much more scheduled, much more regimented. Like there's a time for fun and there's a time not to be fun. And I also think that this, you know, another difference that I see is that, you know, when I went to school, it's kind of like, well, what do you want to do? You know, you're thinking about getting a reasonable job and that kind of stuff, but it was really more like, what's your purpose? Whereas now college, you know, even at a liberal arts institution and like a great educational institution like Yale, it's pre-professional. It's like, how am I going to get my finance job? Literally students will ask me in our first meeting, it's like, okay, I'm a freshman or I'm a first year student. What economics class should I take so that I can make sure I get a job at Google in 4 years? Like, these are the questions they ask, right? Like, you know, it's like how, you know, like I definitely want to work at Facebook, and like, I'd like to, you know, what 4th class should I take that ensures that I get the job? So it's like, they're kind of constantly on this trajectory where they've been planning forever about what their life is going to look like. And there's no room for serendipity, and there's often no room for fun, it feels like, in some contexts, right? Where it's like, they're really just picking based on, you know, what's going to give them a financially stable and a good life, but there's less room for kind of just what they dig and what they enjoy and what's fun.
I'm 10 years old, or I'm a parent of a 10-year-old, or I got a room full of 10-year-olds, which would be 5th graders, right? What do you see in there?
Yeah,
I know you're starting to think a little bit about K-12, right? But
yeah, I mean, I hang out with these younger folks less than you do. I'm more thinking about kind of the older side, you know, but even just, you know, seeing in my friends' families and things, you know, I see the seeds of a few things that are negative in my college students in them. One is just time affluence, right? This phenomena that we know from the research really affects our happiness. Time affluence is just this subjective sense that you have, you know, lots of free time. It's the opposite of what many of us experience, kind of especially now, which is sort of time famine, right? Which is almost starving for time. And the data really suggests that time famine works a lot like hunger famine, where you're triaging, you're literally kind of stressing your body out. Some work by Ashley Willens at Harvard suggests that if you self-report being time famished, that has as much of a hit on your well-being as if you self-report being unemployed, right? Like, it's a big, big hit on our well-being to feel time famished. And I feel like more so than ever, childhood is a period of time famine, where they're running from one thing to another. They're kind of scheduled. They too have one of the seeds of our own time famine as adults, which is what's called time confetti, which is like, you have some free time, but it's this little chopped up blocks here and there, right? It's not like, you know, big expanses of a weekend where you could just kind of hang out and do nothing. And I think that that's likely to be taking a hit on young people's well-being, but more, it's likely to be setting up habits of how you exist in the world that they're going to take with them to college, they're going to take with them into their adult life, and that are going to be hard to shut off. You know, sometimes my students, when they have a free night, they're kind of just like, all right, what do I do now? Like, you know, like, I have free time. It's almost like free time makes them anxious. Like, they're supposed to be doing something. I use this expression with my students where I say they're shoulding all over themselves. They have, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. Like, you know, it's not good, right? To have your whole existence determined by what you should be doing at any one point.
And I'm not seeing as much of that particularly in the younger kids. They're scheduled, but they're not crazy scheduled. But they also don't talk about video games as much. Spend some time on social media. Sometimes they'll grin and say, yeah, I guess I do. But it's not a predominant thing. And it seems to be even less so when I leave the US and the UK and go to other places. It's just not as important. Part of that might tie back. There's a good book. Hold on a second. That I happen to be halfway through. Do you know this book?
I know the book. I have not actually read it yet.
Yeah, you can see I'm halfway through. So Robert Epstein, it basically explains that the way we raise teenagers is more like we raise children than the ways we raise adults, but they really carry most of the capability, capacity, physical, all of that of adults. So we sort of prolong childhood through this, and that ends up being a core of a problem. As I'm reading this, I'm thinking, yeah, it's another theory, and then I'm finding myself drawn into the arguments more and more. It does make sense. It's a very Western thing. But the very Western thing now shows up in Japan and lots of other places because Western thinking. So is this something that we've sort of done ourselves? Did we design this? Because it sounds like we did, based on what you're laying out.
I mean, again,
it seems to take more after they're about sixth grade. Like it does, like whatever it is they're trying, that we are evilly trying to do, that, you know, our nefarious scheme to ruin every child, doesn't seem to take effect until they're in seventh or eighth or ninth grade. But when it does, it's a wallop.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, again, I haven't read the book, so I can't, you know, speak to that necessarily. But yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said for the fact that, you know, my college students right now are showing up in college kind of adulting a little bit less than they did definitely 5-10 years ago, just in terms of simple things. One is that they, again, not all of them, right? I'm making some generalizations here, but I see seeds of cases of students kind of not being able to, and in some cases not being allowed to, sort of sort out the sorts of things that naturally come up in college. So take like roommate issues, right? You know, like roommate gets up late or stays up really late and is being loud. You know, it's a thing that you just have to navigate your roommate issues in college. More so than ever, we see often cases of parents trying to intervene on this, right? You know, parents calling up and be like, you know, I want my child to move, like give my kid a different room or give my child a single. And it's like, no, like parent, you're missing, like, this is one of the like educational hotspots that we do in college where they have to kind of navigate this stuff. You know, the skills they learn in doing this are going to help them in business and help them in stuff. But parents are like, no, just, you know, give my child a single, right? You know, there's a lot of more parental intervention in the student services side than I think we saw 10 years ago. You know, so for a while, maybe a lot of people have heard this term sort of helicopter parent, where there's a problem. The idea is that there's a problem and this parent in a helicopter kind of swoops down to solve the problem. Sociologists nowadays have been using a different term. They call them lawnmower parents. And the idea is the parents are like mowing the lawn ahead of time, like getting all the high grass out of the way so everything is smooth sailing, so there's not even any problems. And I think that does a few things. One is it infantilizes students. You know, students kind of hate it, right? They're not allowed to kind of, you know, solve their own problems. But I think a bigger issue related to well-being, and this gets back to the kind of issue of like, you know, there's no fun there. It's like they don't get to kind of decide their own schedules and their own stuff. You know, I see lots of cases of parents picking student classes, or, you know, at an event, you know, but before the COVID times, we have these big events of these kind of career, you know, major fairs where as a psychologist, I kind of manned the table for what the psychology major was like. And, you know, when I first started doing that, you know, students would come up and say, I'm interested in the psychology major. Now, sometimes you have parents holding the student's hand to be like, my daughter is really interested in psychology. And it's kind of like taking the agency away in these ways that, you know, can't help but kind of leave you in a position where you just haven't had experience to sort out these problems. And so, you know, I'm constantly, you know, because I'm at Yale, I constantly get pushback of like, oh, those snowflakes. And, you know, it's often a generation of like the parent age of these students. And I kind of want to be like, if our kids are snowflakes, there's a reason they got that way. You know, like maybe we should be putting the blame not on the snowflakey students, but the parents who kind of turn them into snowflakes. But yeah.
So clearly there's a lot that isn't just to be thought about. It needs to change because we seem to be creating some very large problems. We'll talk about that after we take this break. All right. So let's say that we have an hour of social emotional learning class in every high school and every elementary school. That'll fix it, right?
I mean, honestly, it'll help, right? In the sense that, I think, for better or for worse, schools are a spot where students are doing a lot of their learning about culture, about norms, about what gives you meaning, about, how one should live a life. I actually think this kind of normative training in schools is really helpful. That said, I'm not sure if an hour alone of social emotional learning is going to fix the whole problem.
But let's extend that. So is what we're talking about a really good suggestion for a course? You teach a course. The rest of the university isn't concerned with that. It's a course. It's one course. As we talk about positive education with various people, the place I'm beginning to move towards is this isn't a course. This is the way we construct childhood and education and learning. But if we're in an environment where everybody's learning the same thing and it's all a competition, I don't know how you break that. I don't know how you break that, particularly when evaluation and all that ends up being so important. In this era of the virus and economic catastrophe and the whole list of things, I think the only way this goes, because distance learning is a little bit bizarre, and I don't know the kids are going to be going into schools, I don't know if teachers are going to be going to schools on a regular basis, you're going to learn on your own, which has a lot to do with the way we've learned for most of human history. If that's so, you're not going to be able to test me because you're going to learn different things that I'm going to learn. And by the way, you know stuff I don't know, and I know stuff you don't know, and that's the reason we're talking to each other. So that, to me, is what learning is all about. And it seems to me the deeper I get into this, the more I write about it, the more people I talk to, it feels as though we've created a situation where school, the purpose of school, the reason, the use of school and teachers as a tool, it seems to be completely sideways. It needs to come from here. So one more little bit of speech making, and then we'll play. As I get deeper into this, the idea of extrinsic motivation as a way to learn seems ridiculous to me. The idea of intrinsic motivation seems to me to be pretty much the way I've always learned. I developed a reputation in college because I was like, I don't understand why we're doing this. And they'd be like, yeah, but you're you. I'm like, no, I think everybody's me. I just think that I happen to be the obnoxious guy from, who's saying something about it. Can you unpack that, or am I just crazy?
No, I think you're not crazy. I mean, I think we've known for a long time how human motivation works, particularly human motivation for learning, but it's honestly human motivation for anything, which is that, we are innately curious creatures. We're going to want to learn on our own. We have these kind of intrinsic motivations to do stuff, whether that be, read a book, or whether that be study a new subject, or that be, run on a treadmill, right? Like, we're not doing that, for some extrinsic reward that's going to come later. We're doing that most of the time, at least, historically, that's been for some internal thing. It just feels good to do it. What we know scientifically is that even if you take the thing that is the most internally rewarding thing for you, if you also slap on an extrinsic motivator, you're going to get paid for it. You're going to get a grade for it. You have to do it. It's a rule I'm making you do it. That kills the internal motivation that you have. And my read is that we've actually set up an education system that is built to systematically destroy the intrinsic motivation of things that kids like, if only through our grading system, right? I have this podcast called The Happiness Lab, and I got to interview Alfie Kohn, who is one of the
last week.
Yes, one of the staunch haters of grades. But he makes this enormous point that the way that grades work is they're an extrinsic motivator for something that intrinsically we want kids to love. And scientifically speaking, like based on the data, like that's just not simpatico. Like that's just not going to work. Some lovely early studies on kids' motivation took some tasks that kids naturally like to do. So you have kids solving anagrams, right? Kind of doing these little puzzles, right? Kids naturally gravitate towards the ones that are the hardest they can possibly do, but they can still do them. If they're like impossible, then that kind of sucks because you're never getting any feedback. But if like it's on the edge of challenging and you can just get there, those are the ones they pick. Now you do that same thing where you're giving kids these anagrams, but you give kids a grade. What happens? all of a sudden kids want to pick the easiest puzzles. They say those are the ones that are the most fun, the ones that give them the best grade. In addition, you up kids' anxiety, like incredibly, and you up their ability. You find cases where kids now start cheating, right? Because if the whole goal is to like get the prize at the end, you want to pick the thing that's the fastest way to do that, and you're even willing to kind of cut some corners. And so what we've done is systematically create an education system that, because of its grading structure, takes things that kids want to do and turns them into things that kids actually hate to do.
So did we do that on purpose? And what I mean by that is, was there a purpose that we were attempting to satisfy by designing the system this way? And if so, does that purpose still exist, and does the intention still exist?
Yeah, so I looked at this a lot. I actually got kind of obsessed with this for a while. I was like, where did grades come from, right? Because they're not like, you know, an inherent thing about educational systems, right? Like somebody had to come up with this idea. And I was embarrassed to learn that they actually started at Yale, which I was like, oh, like, what have you done? But it was former president of Yale, Ezra Stiles, back in the day, you know, was teaching his lectures. Even at Yale, there was a long time when there were no grades. And he had this moment where he realized, I should document how my kids did. Like I should document, like, you know, who kind of really learned stuff and who didn't. And he wrote in his, you know, in Latin in his journal, it's like, you know, these guys were pejores in Latin, you know, they were kind of poor, you know, these guys are, and he actually did it in 4 different levels. So it's kind of like reminiscent of the 4.0, which is really interesting. But it wasn't to, you know, mark these kids for life. It was just in his private journals to kind of keep track of like who was getting the stuff and who wasn't, right? Like we want to know if the kinds of things were working. We want to know if kids are learning. The problem is the act of measuring that gives someone something to strive for, if that's the thing that's really valued, if that's the thing that's going to, you know, make your parents smile and get you into a good college and be the thing that, you know, is the meaning of life, I think, to certain kids in certain schools and in certain grades. And so what we've really done is turn that into the thing that students are shooting for. I don't know if Alfie told this story on the podcast. He told this harrowing story of, you know, he, you know, talks about how grades suck and all the bad things about grades and that we don't need grades and so on. And he was presenting this to a group of high school students. And the first question he got was a high school student who raised their hand and was like, if you're right, then like, what else is there? And he's like, I don't understand. She's like, no, like if you're right and we shouldn't be shooting for grades, like what else is there? And he said that this was damning, right? That, you know, he saw in this, and like all the adults saw in this, like, oh, it's so sad that you lost the love of learning, but she didn't even know what that meant anymore. Like if we weren't going for grades, what else would there be? And he, you know, I mean, Alfie's not normally like kind of stymied, but it sounds like he was like, I don't know, like, you know, beauty and truth and like, oh my gosh, like, you know.
So, but let me ask the question again in a slightly different way. Do we think that as a society, we have decided, or as a Western society, or as the United States, or as the state of Massachusetts, whatever it is, that we said, you know what we want to do is kill creativity? And like, was this by design because we want everybody more or less marching in the same direction?
Yeah,
Because
I mean, I don't know.
Factory workers and the old Prussian model and all that, and having guys not run off, I would think you'd want to do that. But it's not the iPhone that was the pivot point here, because when I was in school, which is before you were in school, I was having these same questions. And when I talked to my dad, who thank goodness is still alive, he's like, yeah, I was too. So now we're back in the 1930s. And he's like, yeah, I don't understand why we're learning what we're learning. I'm like, and then I go back to John Dewey. He's like, he doesn't understand either. It's like, wait a second here. How did this get so different from what it ought to be? And how, but more important, because I think we know that answer, how do we get from where we are now to where we think we need to be? Do we know where we need to be? And do we know how to get there?
Yeah, no, I think these are big, important questions. And I think you're onto something important, which is that, you know, my one class, you know, maybe it taught students a few strategies, and I think it did. You know, we have data suggesting it was, you know, important, and it kind of bumped people's well-being up, but it's a Band-Aid on a huge, awful system, you know? And I think we need to really seriously look at what it means to change that system, right? And it was ironic to do this at Yale, where, you know, I'm literally teaching students, you know, they're reading Alfie Kohn's book, like that we're talking about, you know, study after study showing grades are bad, and I had to give them a grade for their midterm, you know, at the end of the class, right? Because I'm part of the system that I, you know, I as just me don't have the option to change. And so, you know, what would it look like to change the system? You know, if you ask Alfie, he'll say, get rid of grades. You know, there are universities that have done that. There are other ways we can do that. Or if we can't get rid of grades, make grades such that everyone's going to get an A eventually if you keep working hard enough, right? Like the assumption is not an assumption of competition. It's an assumption of cooperation and growth, right?
All right. But do you think all of this is about, I mean, that one word answer, grades, is that the beacon that all of this whole education system and these 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 million students, plus the ones outside the United States, are all being somehow magnetically drawn to? It just seems to me that that's a heavy lift for grades. I mean, I used to know grades in high school. You know, it's like, yeah, I mean, he's not that strong, is he?
I think it's what grades represent, right? And to these students, grades represent your future, you're getting through this stuff. I think, you know, the students are sold that there's a spoil of this war, that if you get it, everything in life will be happy and good. And if you don't get it, it will, you know, embarrass your parents.
But half of them are below average. So, huh?
No, I think it's like, the idea is like, you have to keep, especially the students that I see, right? You know, I'm going to be talking about the students who kind of who win the spoils of the war because they get into a place like Yale. But instantly upon getting into a place like Yale, they're not like, all right, cool, won the war, can like chill out and figure out how to fund right now. They're like, what's the next carrot? Like, what's the next carrot? Oh, the next carrot is like getting a job in finance, or like the next carrot is like, you know, getting into medical school. They're instantly on this path to what's the next thing. And a telling thing that I heard from students was, you know, students put up these wonderful videos, you know, they kind of videotape everything. This gets back to the technology point we'd made before, but one of the things they videotape is their college acceptance reaction. You know, so they film themselves when they're finding out, did you get into Yale or not? And the ones that get in, oh my gosh, they scream, they're so happy. I showed these videos in my happiness class as an example of something. And I got several emails from students who said, you know, we filmed that moment. She's like, but you know what the moment immediately after that was? Incredible deep despair. Because it was like, I put that moment, you know, I worked so hard for that. And as soon as I got it, I realized it wasn't what I expected. And okay, now the real race is on. Now I got to like beat all the kids at Yale and figure out what the next thing is.
That's exhausting. So again, let's change it. So as I've been looking, and when you and I haven't spoken in a few months, a year, whatever, I'm wondering whether we're even coming close to teaching the right subjects. So so let's play that game for a minute. So and I've done some of the research using the OECD data and all that. We've got, I have to remember this, but I'll come close. We have math, we have science, less so social studies, a little bit less so, a little more so second language. Actually, second language beats out social studies, which surprised me. And what am I missing? So we have these 4 or 5 subjects, and that's how we spend our time year after year for 12 years, count kindergarten, 13 years, count preschool, add college, whatever. And I thought, well, if you were to make a list today of what we think people ought to know, I don't think I would put those subjects anywhere near the top. I think I would put global citizenship and who you are in the world. I think I would begin with my body, and then the next thing would be my mind, and then my community. And I would work with that. Now, I may learn some science, some important science there. I may learn history, but I started looking at the New York State curriculum for 5th grade, in which you study New York State. So I started making a list of things that people are expected to know about New York State. And I remember that the Hudson River is a fjord. I always thought that was kind of cool. But the massive information from Cornelius Vanderbilt to the Erie Canal to getting married in Niagara Falls to Rochester and Kodak and Eastman, and the list is like, this feels like a Jeopardy board. It doesn't really feel like learning. It feels like familiarizing yourself in a very broad way when you're in 5th grade about a state that you may or may not stay in. Like it's like, so why am I learning that, but I don't exactly understand my lungs, or why diabetes? Like it just like, so my starting place now is the what, because all of that other, and if you're going to give me a what, I don't necessarily want to study the same stuff you want to study. We're different people, which means the teacher has some work to do, but clearly the teacher is not going to be the sage. That's okay. We have a lot of other resources, and that's okay. But schools kind of awkwardly have to stretch and twist and all that. All of us have this iPhone within reach. Is mine? Yeah, probably somewhere. doesn't work that way. So I think we need more teachers, not less. You know, you get into those questions. So how do we, if that's a path we want to follow, if we begin to deconstruct and then reconstruct, how would you reconstruct this? You are now, I think you're terrific. You're going to be Secretary of Education.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you're going to be Secretary of Education for Trump. No, I'm kidding. But let's say you're Secretary of Education, and the time has come that you have general political support. What you think ought to be, we're going to go for it.
Yeah.
And there's enough people who are unhappy. That's like, yeah, she knows what she's doing. And she actually knows how to, she has a broader sense. So go design the education system for me, and don't do college, do my 5th grade.
Yeah.
Go.
Well, I think honestly, you start with what kids need to know, right? And I think that part of that really looks like an educational system that focuses on character development, right? That asks the question of how you want to live a good life. I mean, ultimately, this is getting back to what, the Greeks did so well. When Plato invited, students to his academy, what did you focus on? It was like how to be a good citizen. And part of the answer to how to be a good citizen meant that you needed to learn some politics, and you needed to learn some math, and you needed to learn some science, right? We need to get back to a bigger reason why we're doing education in the first place. And that reason, at least in my view, if I'm Secretary of Education, is not pre-professional, right? Like you're going to get that pre-professional stuff anyway. And the stuff we're teaching you isn't really pre-professional for most of the pre-professional stuff that people are going to do. Like you're really trying to become a good citizen. So I think that's kind of thing number one. Thing number two is that the goal isn't to separate the wheat from the chaff anymore, right? Like the goal isn't to see who of you are the best so that you can go to a place like Yale or Harvard. Like the goal is to get all of you up to some standard, right? And so metrics like grades, standardized tests, all these things where you pass or you don't pass that are like flooding kids with these extrinsic rewards, we find ways to get out of that. And then the second is, I think you kind of help teachers out. You ask the question, like, why did we build this stuff in? Are we kind of trying to control the masses? Are we trying to kill curiosity and so on? I think no, but, as Alfie Kohn will be the first to point out, grades make it easier for a student. If this teacher has a kid like you, of like, why do we need to learn that? I can say like, it's on the test, it's on the test, Howard, like, that's why you got to learn it, right? So it's a cop out for exhausted teachers. And I think, given the state of education and what teachers are paid and what they're asked to do, like, it's reasonable that teachers are exhausted, right? Like they need way more resources to kind of—
Hold on. You're Secretary of Education. Didn't I hear you just say that we're going to pay teachers more? I thought I heard you say that.
Oh yeah, and we're going to hire a lot more of them. And I'm going to do that on the heels of this pandemic, where every parent I know has said, holy crap, what an exhausting job to have your kids home and to try to get them to focus on stuff. And we're going to ride that wave and be like, see, maybe we should be paying the people who are really good at this more down the line too.
We have technology way beyond iPhone, right? So if I'm learning something that is a struggle, sometimes I need help, right? And we all do. There is a smart enough technology available, whether if we're clever about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and let's assume for the moment that also as Secretary of Education, you decided that all kids own their own data and that nobody can touch it, okay? Let's stay there. So I need some help with, I was using, with Anthony, I was using electromagnetism, which I actually know something about, but we pretended I didn't. I'm struggling with it. Now, I can get there through experiments, diagrams, we can play with things. I got manipulables. I always struggle with that word. How do we install a smart use of technology broadly to lighten the load for teachers without having kids suggest that their teacher should be an iPad and we can fire all the teachers? Like, how do we use technology in an appropriate way? Or is there no appropriate way because we just developed these addictive habits and it's better to stay away from it? Thanks.
I mean, there is something to be said for us developing addictive habits, and it kills social relationship, it kills social connection. But I think part of those addictive habits come from the way technology is designed. I actually think the answer to that question is that you change the incentive structure for the people who are developing the technology, right? Like right now, the incentive structure that's built into every piece of tech we use is that it's trying to get our eyeballs on it as much as possible by any means necessary, right? It's happy to kill our social connection. I think in some cases in social media, it's happy to kill democracy, but that's like another conversation altogether. But it's happy to steal us from our friends, our family, as much as possible. And it's built in a way to kind of draw us in, not in a way that would help our interests, but that would help its own interests. So you said, we'll trust the AI is doing the right things. I worry that with the wrong incentive structure, it simply can't, right?
Let's assume we have the right incentive structure. Let's stay on the positive side of all of this.
Yeah. So we like, refund all startups to like do good in the world and this kind of stuff. Yeah. No, then I think we're in a better system. Then YouTube isn't trying to get you addicted to stuff. It's not trying to show you more extreme stuff just so you'll stay.
Let's assume that
as an incentive to try to teach people. I think we don't have technologies right now that allow us to do that. So it's hard to think, if we had the right incentive structure to build those technologies, then students would just use those. The student could go and be like, I'm curious about volcanoes. And, the system's job wasn't to like get the students obsessed with it and have them only learn about volcanoes or steal. The system's job was to do what was best for that student. And that could be feeding them only the information that they wanted, trying to get them to go back and interact with the real world so that technology wasn't the most interesting thing about volcanoes, that the kid would want to go play in the dirt, right? It would send them off to have real world interactions, both with the real world, the physical world, and with other social agents out there, like other people. I think if we created technology like that, we'd have a boon. But my read is like, we pretty much don't have any technology like that, including educational systems. Because again, the incentive structure is built to like, hey, use me at all costs.
Okay, but again, I want to, unless we dream outside of the situation we're in, nobody writes the plan.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen. So one of the things I've been really encouraging is the future mindedness. So many of the aspects of positive education really should be applied to the adults who have some charge and the kids who are inventing the future. We tend to get very bogged down in, well, we'll improve from here and get better so we're up to normal. I want to know what beyond normal looks like. And I've been pushing very hard on political fronts and others, because if we don't have that dream, how are you going to make a dream come true? What's the Oscar Hammerstein line, right? So I want to know what that dream looks like. And how do we take positive education as a key component in that?
Yeah.
Because I believe that we won't get there without it.
Yeah. The dream is to allow kids to only use their intrinsic motivation to learn what they want to learn, because that is the kind of way that they will become really excited about things. And in that world, you don't have things that are like sucking up kids' motivation. You have only video games that are positive. You don't have things that are going to mindlessly steal them away, like social media and stuff. The only thing they could possibly want to do is like figure out volcanoes. Or
okay, but you're still defining the term by what it's not. I want to know what it is.
What it is? No, I'm saying what it is. I'm saying that what it is that kid comes in and I'm like, today I want to learn about volcanoes, and they have as many resources at their disposal to do that. Right? They have a teacher who is like a real human social agent who's ready to kind of, cultivate that, to give them the right mindset, to infuse some growth mindset. You can work hard, right? So that kind of character development is coming through the social agents. The tools that they have at their disposal, both technological and in terms of the things that are around them, can allow kids to explore and so on. And they're doing that in a domain with other kids where they can do this sort of thing together. And this is really built from the research on, like, if you have kids kind of exploring on their own, you give kids some puzzle box, you give kids some fun things, they're going to have this curiosity to do that stuff. And, in that, we don't have any systems where we're like trying to extrinsically reward them or grade them. We just trust that natural curiosity paired with these resources will allow kids to develop the stuff that they reasonably need to do to be a like adult who's going to do something good in the world.
But how will Yale ever know which students to accept if you're learning about volcanoes your way and I'm learning about forest fires my way?
Then I'm not an admissions officer at Yale, and I'm not affiliated with Yale. This is not Yale's opinion. But then the Yales of the world do something else, or they admit what is really true, which is that this is a lottery, right? Like maybe it's just a lottery to get into these places, or maybe we try to make Yales for everyone. You mentioned all these technologies and the things we can do. My online class now goes to 2.9 million people. Right? It didn't necessarily have to just go to the students who took it, to ourselves. And so if we're thinking about education, not as a like box ticking and who can get the spoils of the war in this big competition for a winner take all, then we start thinking really differently about what even the Yales of the world will look like. Maybe it's open to everyone.
So I'm a teacher. I'm teaching that 5th grade class. God save that teacher. She's got me in the class. What is this positive education thing again? Is it different from social emotional learning? And is this some sort of a magic box that I need to dive deeply into? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, I define positive education that the idea is that education's goal should be human flourishing. It should be all the things that allow us to kind of experience flourishing, where we have meaning in the world, we're experiencing lots of positive emotion, we feel like we're doing good in the world, we're being of service in the world. You want to set up educational systems that allow you to do that. And part of that is trying to infuse like the sorts of things that build up well-being into educational systems. So even simple things like promoting service, like doing things that really develop people's character so that they can figure out their strengths and use them. Trying to get people to recognize, and doing the sort of thing that I do in my class, like what the science of flourishing really is, kind of going through and maybe nipping some bad habits in the bud, or nipping some bad ideas, some bad cultural ideas in the bud, and sort of infusing better cultural ideas that are a little bit more evidence-based. That's the sort of way I think about positive education.
So what about the kids who have needs that prevent them from getting there? I've got to take care of my brother and my sister before, all those issues, right? And we're very familiar with them. And it's a lot of people. I mean, in Philadelphia County, 1 in 3 Black children is poor. Yeah. So these are formidable issues. How do we take what you're talking about, which sounds terrific, and apply it as broadly as possible, or do we have to take care of the people who it's easier for, and then gradually it'll trickle down?
I think the way you really sort this out is that you solve social justice issues too. Because if there's kind of the possibility that you could be in this awesome 1%, or you could be in this awesome category, you're going to want to subtly figure out the things that you do it. So it might be that a fully realized positive education system has to sort out poverty and inequality first. It's a very kind of anti-capitalist notion in lots of ways, like when you really flesh it out. I think that ultimately is the right solution.
Is it a socialist notion?
No. My strong sense is that like we are in like late stage capitalism, where we know capitalism isn't an awesome idea, but when we've like really played out socialism to its like extremes, it doesn't look so hot either. And so I actually think that there's real work to be done about, okay, if capitalism wasn't right, what is really the right answer? And I actually think that that's the spot where the science of well-being can really help us to kind of go back to the basics, if you look at like who's the father of positive psychology, we met working with Marty Seligman, and I think, Seligman is the father, but if you scroll way back, the father of this stuff was like Aristotle, it's like, the folks in Plato's Academy were thinking about eudaimonia, right? Like they were thinking about
You might want to define that word for the people out there who don't know what it is, right?
Yeah. Eudaimonia is a Greek word for kind of flourishing, like living the good life. What does that mean? It's kind of happiness, but happiness in a really rich, not just like, oh, I'm like hedonistically happy and eating all this awesome food and like, having great sex. It's like happiness in the rich sense of what it means for your life to flourish and have meaning. And they were thinking about that back then. That's why they were studying math and science, right? Is that they were trying to figure out what meant for a good life.
I think that's a really good place to say thank you. This was terrific, and we got into some depth and went into a couple of different directions that, I don't think either of us saw coming, but that's fine. That's good. So we're going to roll the credits. If you can hang on for a minute right afterwards, that'd be great. Michael, all yours. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.